TGI Fridays prepares to file for bankruptcy.
A group of investors are going to be acquiring the restaurant chain by the end of the month.
As soon as Mother's Day was done, they shut the doors and didn't tell anybody.
2024 was a tough year for the restaurant industry. Over 200 restaurant and bar companies filed for bankruptcy, the most in at least a decade, including in 2020.
That's actually a very interesting statistic that they're referencing right here. That there's more bankruptcies for bars and restaurants in 2024 than there were in 2020 during COVID. That is very interesting. Presumably this has something to do with some of those stipends and funding from the government at that time, because you can see a pretty sizable spike in 2022 as well. So maybe there's something going on here where they kind of postponed bankruptcy, hoping to come back post-COVID, and that maybe they're seeing initial signs that they aren't going to be able to come back, as we can see here in 2022, and then maybe again in another round in 2024, after they maybe tried some more things, or maybe some bigger restaurants and chains had some cash lying around to kind of extend their runway a bit. That's very interesting. It's literally over double what they're showing here on this graph between 2024 and 2020.
21 were chains, and of those, 10 were backed by private equity. The most notable were two of America's biggest casual dining restaurants, Red Lobster and TGI Fridays.
Companies that are owned by private equity firms are significantly more likely to go bankrupt than those that aren't. What can work for the private equity firm in the short term may not necessarily work for the restaurant in the long term.
Between 2014 and 2024, private equity firms invested a total of $94.5 billion into the industry.
One of the things that private equity brings, in addition to capital, is expertise. They've seen this movie before, right? They've run businesses like this.
Private equity's expanding influence on America's long-standing restaurant chains has received plenty of attention, mainly because things haven't gone so well. The term private equity is widely used, but perhaps not always understood. It applies to investment firms that finance private companies for mainly two reasons. Either because they showcase a lot of potential early on, or they're struggling and need a bailout. Regardless, the goal is simple: cash out by helping the company go public, or turn it around to sell it at a profit. Usually with...
I'm really glad that they took a moment to explain this early on. Sometimes in videos, they can kind of leave this till the end of the video, and then some people might not be following along. But as mentioned, the primary purpose of private equity is to make a profit. They aren't really invested in the product or the business itself. Their entire goal is to put money in and leave. That's all they do. And so this changes the dynamic between where this money is coming from and the owners of that business. I think depending on your intentions as the business owner, these might not be aligned. And again, this is where one of those scenarios is the company isn't doing well, and so they might not have a choice. But for these private equity firms, usually they're looking to really push on profitability or make some financial move that makes sense for them. And so, at least from what I've seen, this can lead to issues long term. So I think basic examples are, you could do a lot of layoffs, and then this will immediately make your financial sheet look so much better. It's a classic technique that's used in the industry, and so this is something that arguably makes the service and the product worse, but makes it seem like a way better business than it might have been before. And so these things might not be aligned with the ultimate good of that business, and in this case, restaurants. But that's what the private equity firm is aiming for. Whereas presumably, if you are a business owner in a restaurant, you're primarily looking at how good is our product, profit margins, and the overall experience itself. Whereas the private equity firm might just be looking at those profit margins. And so this is where it doesn't necessarily mean that they're inherently disaligned, but this is where there's a good chance that they will focus on other things that aren't necessarily in the best interest for long-term success.
Within 5 to 8 years. For this story, we'll focus on a transaction type called a leveraged buyout, or an LBO, commonly used by private equity firms. A firm buys a company, using mostly borrowed money from a lender or bank, and as little as possible of its own cash. The company it purchases is then used as collateral on the loan, and ultimately saddled with the debt. It's risky, and highly dependent on high cash flow.
Restaurants generally have a lot of cash flow coming in every day. People are coming to the restaurants every day, and that steady cash flow can be used to pay down the debt that's required to buy up the business.
In 2024, leveraged buyouts in the US declined by about 5% from 2023. However, restaurant and bar LBOs surged by more than 41%. The hope is that the acquisition can revive the business by bringing in management expertise, strategic guidance, and much-needed cash. Sometimes, selling to private equity is the only option. But these types of transactions can be crippling, especially when cash-strapped consumers pull back on spending. Rising and floating interest rates are another issue. They rose 11 times between 2022 and 2023. LBOs also limit a restaurant's ability to invest in innovation or improve operations. Companies acquired this way were more likely to default on their loans.
That's why we've seen a tremendous number of bankruptcies in the private equity space in recent years, and also why we've seen distress and troubled companies that have been acquired by private equity firms, and why we are not seeing a lot of IPOs.
Take Red Lobster. At its peak, it employed 36,000 people, serving 64 million customers annually in more than 600 locations. But the company's sluggish sales and declining visits led to its 2014 sale to Golden Gate Capital for $2.1 billion. But a decade later,
Red Lobster filing for Chapter 11, bankruptcy. Among the list of reasons blamed, difficult macro, bloated and underperforming restaurant footprint, and failed or ill-advised strategic initiatives.
TGI Fridays had a similar path. It had 500 U.S. locations a decade ago. By the time it filed for bankruptcy, it had 135.
That is quite the difference. I would have to admit that I don't really frequent either of these restaurants. So this could be something that is not necessarily just a private equity issue. This could be, again, these were struggling businesses already. Private equity tried to inject cash to see if that could help turn it around, and that they had potentially seen success in these businesses before. This maybe bought them a few more years. They didn't see it turn around, and so now they're going under. And so there's nothing saying that these businesses wouldn't have gone under without private equity. But again, the fact that they're shrinking in their footprints, to me, signals that they're basically trying to find ways to get their profitability to seem better. And so likely you're going to do that by reducing your number of stores, especially the least profitable ones, until eventually there's less and less stores, and then they likely aren't able to afford the recurring payments on the debt that they basically have to pay back.
It was also bought by a leveraged buyout, but failed a decade later. These failures aren't unique to these two brands. LBOs don't have a strong track record. In 2023, 2/3 of all defaulted LBOs were by companies backed by private equity.
I think that goes back to how those deals are structured, with a lot of debt that these businesses have to pay back. Those sales obviously work typically very well for the private equity firms, often work extremely well for the executives at the restaurant chains. But I think, as we've seen with Red Lobster and others, it's often not great for the long-term health of the business.
When Red Lobster first announced its bankruptcy, many were quick to blame the company's endless shrimp promotion as the main culprit.
Ultimate endless shrimp is here.
But it really wasn't about the endless shrimp. That was a costly episode, but it was certainly nowhere near as costly as the initial sale of the very high-level premium real estate locations.
So this is a great point that she's bringing up right now. So there is a combo effect of, if you have a retail location, it could be acting as an advertisement for you. So here, for instance, this Red Lobster in New York, presumably that a bunch of people are seeing this, they are thinking about Red Lobster, whether they would like to or not. And so as you shrink your footprint, then less people see you, and then there's potentially even less demand for your particular restaurant because you're out of sight, out of mind. And so these things can spiral out of control in a negative way.
That Red Lobster had.
The initial sale of premium real estate that Morganson's referencing is the so-called sale-leaseback deal that happened in tandem with the 2014 Red Lobster buyout. Its new owner, private equity firm Golden Gate Capital, sold the real estate of 500 Red Lobster locations for $1.5 billion to a real estate company. Red Lobster then leased those properties from their real estate company. That's a sale-leaseback.
Wow, that is interesting. This is quite a sort of conflict of interest, I guess, here, where I guess in essence you do own the business, but this is sort of where like you're going through a business, you're taking out anything of value, and then you're just leaving whatever's left over. So obviously that's going to set that business up for failure.
While there are some tax benefits and freed up capital for the private equity firm, Red Lobster had to repay the debt from a buyout on top of rent. In 2020, Golden Gate Capital sold its remaining equity stake in Red Lobster to a consortium comprised of publicly traded seafood supplier Thai Union, who already had a 25% stake in the chain. At the time, Red Lobster had a $380 million loan that was due summer 2021. It later refinanced, but pandemic restrictions and rising interest rates further contributed to the seafood chain's downfall. In May 2024, the month it filed for bankruptcy, almost half of its bills were at least 91 days late, according to CreditSafe.
There are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of pieces to the puzzle. It is not just black and white that sale-leasebacks always result in problems, but they often do. So Red Lobster was really in a vise. And that is, I think, central to the reason why it failed.
It's important to note that there are also cases where a company will sell its real estate in a sale-leaseback deal without the backing of private equity. Burger chain Red Robin, for example, sold nearly 30 restaurants for $84 million using the strategy over the course of 3 deals as part of a turnaround plan.
Now, that generates a quick hit of cash. But what it means is that the restaurant is now responsible for paying for something every quarter or every month that it used to own outright. And it also means that it no longer has an asset that it can borrow against in tough times.
In the case of TGI Fridays, its new private equity owners tried to reduce its debt by selling the company-owned restaurants to franchisees, but that majorly depleted the company's assets. A poorly executed $450 million deal later meant the company's survival became dependent on achieving sales targets it couldn't hit. Other financial strategies private equity uses are roll-ups, where a firm squashes competition by buying up similar businesses in an industry or area, enabling it to either raise prices or lower wages. Like Roark Capital, for example, whose restaurant portfolio has grown to 20 chains as of February 2025. After its latest deal with Subway in 2024, it now owns 2 competing sandwich companies. It has previously been accused of cutting service and lowering the quality of its other eateries. And in 2021, it helped defeat legislation that would have raised the federal minimum wage to $15.
Any kind of dominance, any kind of monopolistic behavior will increase costs for end users and will drive down wages for employees because they won't have a choice.
Efficiency for private equity is key. Firms tend to close underperforming restaurants, consolidate vendors, and launch promotions, but also invest in technology and expansion.
I think the biggest misconception is that private equity is going to derive the greatest portion of value creation through cost cutting. Certainly, you want to be efficient, but we all know you got to spend money to make money, right? And if the goal here is to make the asset have a greater value, there has to be investment in that.
CNBC reached out to Roark Capital and the private equity firms and
That was an interesting point that individual just made. Arguably, maybe I just fell into this trap, but I would have loved to see if she backed that up with data. Because again, at least from what we've seen, they did exactly as is. They basically ripped out all the real estate from these locations. Then they basically shrunk the locations and aimed for cutting costs effectively. So it wasn't just cutting costs, it was cutting costs and also pillaging these chains for basically everything they're worth. And so I think in that earlier example, it was Red Lobster. I think they were purchased for $2.1 billion. And then they took out real estate in an order of $1.5 billion. So that's where you took out 75% of the value of that company through its real estate shortly after you purchased it. And then you basically increase their recurring monthly payments to the point where they weren't able to sustain themselves. So We've seen a number of examples already through this video that kind of prove that is the case. Now, again, to her point, that's not going to be every single case. There's always going to be some fraction that are actually trying to improve it to some extent, and whether they are successful or not is a whole other discussion. But I'm personally still finding it hard to believe. Maybe her point was it's not all of them or not all the time, which I totally agree with. But I don't know if I would accept that statement without some backing information on whether or not this is still actually the general premise and the general process that these equity firms use without seeing some data backing it up. If any of you watching have data that proves this is not their standard MO as an equity firm, I'd love to see it. I'd love to learn and find out that I'm wrong about something and correct myself. But otherwise, we've mostly seen data to the contrary of her point, unless her point was just not 100% of the time, just 80, 90%.
Involved with Red Lobster and TGI Fridays. However, all declined CNBC's request for an interview or comment. The American Investment Council, an advocacy organization for private equity, said the industry has, quote, an overwhelmingly successful record of partnering with restaurants. In the case of TGI Fridays or Red Lobster, it's hard to know exactly what would have happened without private equity's involvement.
Every company has its own particular quirks and reasons why it goes into problems, but again, it was the debt that TGI Fridays had from way back when.
Just because a restaurant hasn't...
I think this is a good point, at least what I'm assuming they're bringing up, which is I interpreted this as it might not be private equity's fault. And that could be the case, because while this individual is stating the eventual failure is due to them having large recurring bills, that's half of the problem. Technically, the other half of this problem is they didn't have enough income to pay those bills. And so in these scenarios, this business presumably wasn't doing well. That's why they ended up getting taken over by private equity. And so they still might have just extended the life of Red Lobster. There's a chance that Red Lobster would have failed years before if they didn't get the injection of cash at that point in time. And so again, I feel like that is half of the equation. The entire premise of the failure is obviously they didn't have enough cash coming in to offset the cash going out. And so you can say the fact that they had to have cash going out is what led them to failure, but every business does have that. And so I think it is an interesting point that I believe they're trying to make here, which is there's no real way of knowing if private equity didn't come in for Red Lobster that they would have potentially exceeded eventually. There's nothing showing that. If they were already on a trend of failure, they might have just failed no matter what happened at that point.
Gone bankrupt doesn't mean that private equity is successful. P.F. Chang's is still struggling to pay off debts from its LBO while dealing with industry-wide pressures like cash-strapped consumers and rising interest rates that have hurt casual dine-in concepts in particular, even if investors inject more cash. The industry itself is volatile and exposed to a lot of risk.
There's been a bunch of headwinds that have affected the restaurant industry writ large, and I think those would apply irrespective of who owns the particular concept. Operating is hard. It's hard for private equity firms, and it's hard for strategic firms. Running a business is hard work.
The latest multi-billion-dollar deals in smoothies, sandwiches, and frozen custard will also serve as another litmus test for leveraged buyouts. And a few of 2024's failed restaurants have already exited their bankruptcy, including Red Lobster in September 2024, when it was acquired by a group of private equity firms through yet another leveraged buyout. Plus, antitrust regulation on mergers and acquisitions is coming in February 2025 that will force companies to be more transparent about the strategies they use and who their investors are. This could bring more scrutiny to and even limit some of private equity's tactics like roll-ups. It's unclear how the current administration will deal with them. Bellew believes the industry needs more regulations, not less.
I don't think it's a given that to survive in the restaurant business, that these restaurant chains need to sell themselves to private equity firms. But as long as we have a legal system that incentivizes extractive, short-term thinking, I worry that private equity investments are going to be much more destructive for the restaurant industry than they're going to be helpful.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.